This is WCN, the Whole Care Network. You talk, we listen. Content presented on the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent views of the Whole Care Network. Always consult your physician for medical and fitness advice, and always consult your attorney for legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Have you ever met anybody that has caregiving on their bucket list of things to do in life?
Beyond caregiving, how do we care?
We also have to care for ourselves.
How do we treat friends, family, strangers we meet?
Forget it.
How do we heal? The physical, social, financial, spiritual.
Hello.
By creating healing ties. Tying it all together like a bow tie. With your host, Christopher McClellan, the Bow Tie Guy.
Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Ties 2.0. You know me as Christopher McClellan, your host, the Bow Tie Guy. So thanks for joining us today. And have you had a chance to check out our new website on the Whole Care Network? We are in beta through the rest of the month, which would be March, and we're loading content up as it comes in. We're having new podcasters join the network. And speaking of new podcasters, you'll be seeing some information of this coming out on social media, but we are giving away 50 spots to new podcasters who have a story to share in and around caregiving and aging that match our 4 pillars of care. That would be our physical care, our spiritual care, our financial care, and our emotional care. So if you've got a message and a story that you'd like to share, and especially if you're new to podcasting, we want to talk to you and offer you one of our 50 free spots on the Whole Care Network. Just email me directly at wecare@wholecarenetwork.com. Again, that's wecare@wholecarenetwork.com, and we'll be looking forward to visiting with you. Well, enough of the promotions today, but I'm excited to welcome our guest, Ken Stern, who is the founder and chair of the Longevity Project, which he founded in collaboration with Stanford Center on Longevity. The Longevity Project fosters public conversation and research on the impact of longer lives on civil society. Ken is the host of multiple podcasts, including When I'm 64. I'm still trying to be a guest on that podcast. We'll have to check that out here in a few minutes. But and that's also in conjunction with the Stanford Center on Longevity. And Ken's got a long list of great accolades, and I've had the pleasure of talking to him before, and now I get to welcome him to Healing Ties. Ken, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
This is kind of like we've done this before.
I know.
It's like old hats, but it's such a wonderful career in broadcasting and journalism and PR, and now you're involved in the Longevity Project. Tell our listeners a little bit about that.
So this is a project, as you said, and thank you for the introduction. It is a project we launched about 2 years ago with the Stanford Center on Longevity. And the Center on Longevity at Stanford really sort of is sort of unique in thinking about the impact of longevity, not just in the consequences of old age, but sort of in how we think about our longer lives. So in some ways, longevity is one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. Our lifespans have almost doubled the last 150 years, but we still act and operate as if our lifespans are much shorter. So the retirement age hasn't changed, how we educate ourselves And how we take care of family members really hasn't changed all that much to reflect this extraordinary demographic change that has taken on. So really what we're trying to do, what folks at Stanford have been trying to do for a decade and a half, really rethink how we organize ourselves, how we think about ourselves, how we take care of ourselves in light of this longer life that we're all taking part in now.
It's kind of like having a plan for aging.
It's actually a plan for, I wouldn't say just for aging, for the whole life, right?
For the
Because
whole
actually,
life, like kind of like the lifespan, sure.
yeah. So one of the things, the most important part of your longer life is actually the first few years. So a lot of the
Right.
things we learn about sort of successful plan for successful life relates to what you do in early childhood. So thinking about our successful longer lives starts with being smart and investing in early childhood health, early childhood education, and things like that.
That certainly sets the tone. As I look back, I think I mentioned to you before, I'm the youngest of six. I have four older sisters. All of them have outlived our mother by 10 years or more.
Yeah.
In one instance, close to 20. And it's amazing when you think about just a lifespan in a family. I would imagine there are thousands upon thousands of examples of that are out there that you're just not prepared for as you age.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, we have seen largely a linear growth in lifespan over the last 150 years. It's actually sort of an odd year to be talking about longer life. And in fact, that because of the pandemic, the tragedy of the pandemic, lifespan is
Right.
actually a little bit shorter this year than
A little
the year
bit,
before.
very much so.
Yeah. But assuming and hoping and praying that this is not a replicable year, that we don't see it ever again, we're going to see longer lives going forward for the foreseeable future. And we're going to see multiple generations of families alive at the same time, not just one, not just two, not just three, but four or even five generations of family. And that's the first time in human history. And it's a big change that we need to understand and think about.
And the other issue that it certainly brings up, and you're going to be dealing with that in a wonderful national conversation that you're having on March 31st, is the implication around aging and caregiving.
Yeah. So I do want to say one thing first about that, which is when people hear that we're going to live longer, they often associate that with more years of ill health. And in fact, it's not true. By and large, the years have been added are healthy years, which is sort of the great gift of longevity. But there's no getting around it. We're having a much older society, and that increases the challenges of caregiving. And one of the things the pandemic revealed, I think, in a frightful way, is the cracks in our caregiving system, the failures of nursing homes, the challenges of taking care of elderly relatives in the pandemic when you can't engage with them. So it's, I think, a time for both reflection and action to say what went wrong, recognize what went wrong, and how are we going to support family caregivers better in the future. And you were kind enough to mention the National Conversation on Caregiving, which is something where we, along with Stanford, are launching at the end of this month, starting on March 31st, to really try to elevate the discussion about solutions and how to help family caregivers better in the future than we have in the past.
I think if there's one good thing that's come out of the pandemic this past year is the ability for us to have these more open and honest conversations about the issues that we face. I mean, everybody has had to deal with the pandemic in one way or another, and it's put these often silent issues that are not often talked about, life planning, our mortality. It's put these into the forefront, which I think has allowed us to talk a little bit more openly about it.
I think that's right. I mean, I think part of that's from the tragedy of it all. The tragedies punched us all in the face. But I also think there's something about the way we've communicated in the past year. By Zoom has sort of brought us all into each other's houses and lives, sometimes in slightly embarrassing ways, sometimes in very personal ways. And I think that's been good because I think it's, people understood sort of the challenge of balancing children at home and work, taking care of elderly relatives and work. I think you're quite right that it has humanized all of us to a certain extent.
So I think that if there's one social issue that binds diverse cultures and diverse individuals, it's caregiving, because caregiving impacts everybody. It doesn't matter. Doesn't have any boundaries. Doesn't have any orientation boundaries, economic boundaries. It's in every community. It's in every boardroom, and it's a conversation that people can have now that it's a little bit more out in the open that will have impact on decision making and policy making. And you're starting that conversation.
I think you're right. We're all either have been caregivers, are caregivers, will be caregivers. So I think I'm stealing that from Rosalind Carter.
But that's okay.
That's okay. It's a situation that affects all of us and will affect us later in our lives too. I think the numbers of the estimates are 53 million caregivers in the country. I think it's probably a little bit higher than that now.
Right.
And it's a issue that affects all of us. And we don't actually, I think you've been quite right to say this year has changed the conversation a bit, because I think we've not necessarily acknowledged ourselves as caregivers, or people don't acknowledge themselves as caregivers often enough. I think that has changed, and I think it is the right time to really focus on the issue. How do we help people, not just the caregivees, the care partners, but the caregivers themselves?
Right. Very good. So talk a little bit about the conference that's coming up on March 31st.
So the one on March 31st is really just a kickoff. So it's an event that focuses. So we're starting it with caregiving in Congress. This is actually the first time, I think, in an organized way that Congress really has a chance to dive into the issue. You have an administration that is new to office and has a caregiving plan. It's a conversation that's going to include Jim Langevin from Rhode Island, the congressman from Rhode Island.
Congressman, yep. Mm-hmm.
And then sort of three extraordinary experts, Terry Fulmer from the John Hartford Foundation, Jennifer Olson from the Rosalind Carter Institute, and John Brody from the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care. And we're going to talk about some of the opportunities for Congress to actually make a difference in caregiving. And that's just the first. We're going to actually have monthly conferences or monthly events. The second one's going to be on caregiving and communities of color. And the third, I think, will probably be on caregiving and innovation. So we have sort of a whole year's worth of activities planned out to really dive into the topics of how to advance caregiving in this country.
Well, I'll have to have you back on a monthly basis to talk about all these all these conversations. Of course, I'm a little prejudiced because I enjoy talking to you. So, but
it's mutual.
But the offer is there.
If you invite me back, I'll come. So it's
open. You have an open mic.
I'm not sure your listeners would want to hear me that often, but I'm always happy to talk with you.
Yeah. Well, we're looking forward to those conferences, especially on a continuing basis. But I kind of want to shift gears to When I'm 64. Tell us about your podcast.
Yeah. So fellow podcasters here. So we actually started really our work, and this again is with our colleagues at the Stanford Center on Longevity, last year when we launched Stanford's first podcast in the longevity space called When I'm 64, The Story of Caregivers. And in many ways, we're trying to do the same thing there in the podcast that we're trying to do with our conferences and events. And we started with, and the podcast, which comes out every 3 weeks, always starts with the story of a caregiver, and then uses that story to illuminate an issue around caregiving. And then we bring in some experts to talk about it. So last episode that just came out was focused on a really sort of extraordinary story of caregiving and Down syndrome. Yes. So this is actually a story. We tend to think of caregivees as being older and the caregivers as being younger, right? And this is flipped. Right. It's older parents taking care of children with Down syndrome and the challenge of that. We had a woman named Paula Gann, who was an amazing force of nature, tell her story of taking care of her daughter, who's now in her 40s. Paula's 77, taking care of her daughter, and the beauty of that story and the challenges of that story. It was sort of a privilege to talk with her and then talk about some of the challenges of the disability community and caregiving.
It really is a privilege to be able to talk with people and have them share their story, because we learn so much in this vast network of caregiving about other people's stories. And then there's that connection, that instant connection that you have with people, even that you don't really know, because you understand about being in the trenches yourself. And the other thing that it does, it helps bring out three things: validation, resources, and some respite for when one caregiver can share their story to another, because we all get it.
Yeah, I think that's right. We do the same thing, right? We talk to caregivers and illuminate their stories. And Paula was an extraordinary story, but I guess we're on about our 15th episode. Every episode has a story that I think is sort of compelling. It is compelling and meaningful, and I think hopefully speaks to the broader caregiving audience about challenges we all face.
And I think the next step for you is you're going to be talking about caregiving as it relates to the pandemic.
Yeah, so we want to do an episode, sort of a look back. Obviously, the pandemic has changed caregiving. So the next episode is actually Jennifer Olson, who I've never talked to before, but going to talk to both the podcast and our event back to back. And Grace Whiting, who runs the National Alliance for Caregiving.
Grace is off the charts.
Isn't she? Yeah. So
you cannot find a nicer person and so committed than Grace Whiting in this sphere.
Grace has actually been on our podcast before and is amazing. These two amazing caregivers and authorities on the subject are going to come join us and talk about what they've learned during the year of the pandemic. How has it changed caregiving, and look back and then a look forward. It's been a year that we've all suffered through together. What does it mean for the future? And we haven't recorded the episode yet. I actually do that on Friday. So I'm really looking forward to talking with Jennifer and Grace and getting the benefit of their expertise and insights.
Well, definitely tell Grace hello from me, and I'll be anxious to listen to that episode as well. But Ken, we can go on for hours upon hours, but I want to do some more of these with you. But let our listeners know a number of things. Let them know how they can register for the event on March 31st and where they can find When I'm 64.
Yeah, you asked great set of questions. I appreciate that. So you can find the podcast. You can pretty much find it wherever
on any podcast platform, I would imagine. Yeah.
The home for it is at the Stanford Longevity Center website, which is longevity.stanford.edu. And you can find out our events at that website or at the Longevity Project website, which is longevity-project.com. And all our events are free. And part of our goal is really we're an educational organization, and all our events are free and open to the public. And we'd love it if everyone came and listened and put in their questions, because we also ask the audience for questions during our events.
Well, I have already registered, so I will be attending, and I hope all of our listeners out there will register as well. And Ken, with all the great work that you're doing, you are certainly someone who's creating healing ties all around us. I can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's a privilege to be here and having the chance to talk with you again.
And we'll do more of these down the road, I'm sure.
I look forward to it. Thanks.
Okay, well, that does it for this episode of Healing Ties. As you know, I'm your host, Christopher McClellan. I've created a life to love after caregiving ends by radio, writing, travel, advocacy, and being with awesome people like Ken Stern. Healing Ties is a part of the Whole Care Network. Check us out online at thewholecarenetwork.com. And thanks to our executive producer, Bill Oddman, in the posh studios of Oddvox Productions in downtown St. Louis. We'll see you for another episode of Healing Ties real soon. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Ciao.
This is WCN, the Whole Care Network. You talk, we listen.